So now that we know what we want to achieve, it's time to share the news with the team. In Agile, we do that through user stories. User stories are nothing more than a promise of a conversation, but an important conversation. The goal of this conversation is to help everyone achieve a shared understanding about the problem we're trying to solve. Let's find out what quality means in the story creation stage. So after requirements are out of the way, what should come next? You guessed it right. It's time to write some nice tickets so we have our team ready to be productive. So how do we write good tickets? How do we create stories? So I'm guessing since you're watching us, you're familiar with the three amigos. So three amigos are the developer, the QA, and the product owner or the business analyst or someone representing business needs. Uh, During this phase, it is said that collaboration must happen very closely between those three participants. Um, so just to introduce this subject, Pia, would you care to give me like an idea of how do they work together as in a high level view, like Dev, QA, and PO, and why is it good?
Um, yeah, sure. Well, you already mentioned the three amigos, and that's basically that's the key. Like you bring together those three different disciplines and skill sets, and that's already like what's the big advantage. So when they come together, you have the QA skills and the testing skills, that quality eye. You have the business view, so no matter if it's business analysis or product owner or requirements engineer, um, and then you have the dev perspective, whether it's a developer or architect. When they create those working items, those stories together, you have the big advantage. If only one of them would create the story for on his or her own, then most probably that person would not be thinking about the other two disciplines that much, because that person cannot be the specialist in all the three areas. So that's why it's much more efficient when they do it, the three of them together already in the beginning. So in the end, it saves you a lot of time, and you have all the knowledge you need already packed together in that one story. So it saves time in the end.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Andy, since you are battle tested on both sides, development and QA, how do you know when you see like a user story that you think, okay, this is well written. I can see there's not a single perspective. This was written by the three amigos. How can you tell quickly by looking at the user story this is good?
Very easy, right? It has all the aspects we need to work on the story. That's very high definition, right? And probably no one can, tell what that means. But for me, it's really that the story has a purpose in it, which reflects what should be done, why should it be done, and what's the actual value delivered to the business. What's the reason behind? That's probably the obvious points, but additionally afterwards, it's very on how it's designed. So for example, are the acceptance criteria written in a way that they are verifiable? Are they testable? Is perhaps even in a story already test cases or test scenarios in, or even hints on where might be pitfalls in it?
So writing good user stories. So I've read something. I'm a bit of a fan of acronyms because they help me remind of what should I think about when doing something. And I came across this INVEST acronym to writing user stories. So for those of you who don't know what INVEST is, so it's independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So what's interesting to think about is that story creation is a teamwork, right? Between the three amigos. So how do the three amigos play along when they try to follow the INVEST principle? So for example, the first one is independent, right? So making work as independent from each piece as possible, so that you're able to scale your development, right? So a team can work on a feature, another team can work on this feature, and there's no conflicts. So what would you say is the contribution of a PO or a business analyst in this aspect? Because from the development side and the QA side, it's easier to see, I think.
For me, business analyst or PO, either that person has the knowledge also to, you know, to judge whether a story is independent or not. And if not, that's totally fine. I mean, that's why we are a team. But then, so the PO, especially the POs, should be open to what the team tells him or her. So when the team says, no, this is not independent enough, we need to break it down, or we need to frame it differently, then the PO should accept, and or at least, like, you know, have a discussion with the team, because then in the end the PO also learns and gets to know the team much better, and then for the future knows better how an independent work item should look like.
I see. So this is pretty much like a negotiation, right? Because it has to be independent from the three perspectives, right? So the QA must be able to test those increments individually. Those increments individually must mean something to the product owner, as well as developers must be able to work independently on those three pieces. So it's really difficult to negotiate all that, right, between the three amigos to come up with something that's really, really independent in these three measurements.
Well, let me just hook in there. How you phrased it, you said that it should deliver independent value from the PO's perspective, but we're in the independable part, right? Here in this section, it's actually not yet about value. It's just about separation. So strongly said, that's not yet come into play.
Yes, I'm getting ahead of myself in the acronyms. You were absolutely right. We were talking about negotiation. So the next one is negotiable, right? We will get to the valuable, and I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about the valuable part, because that's always a difficult question. But the negotiation, right? So that means the batch of work, the iterable batch of work, can be renegotiated as when we receive feedback, right? Because it's an iteration. We may have a user story that's written, but there is an iteration happening. We just got feedback, and perhaps we may need to change something there. So it needs to be negotiable, right? So have you ever seen a case where you had to negotiate a user story based on feedback received?
For me personally, not specific. Well, I need to perhaps make a disclaimer here. What we need with negotiable, is it meant during the refinement process or during the implementation process?
Let's say during the refinement process.
Yeah, because in reality, how I lived it was mostly that for a feature, we created a lot of the stories ahead of time, added it to the backlog, and then sometime in the future we added it to the backlog again, right? So when we create a story, we just create them based on the current situation, and if it changes, we adjust it in the future. So we don't really, I'm not used to it that during a creation of the story, we have different options, because I feel like that this is not as transparent to the team and straightforward to the team.
I don't think it's about having different options. I think it's about having a user story open enough so that you can change things about it, perhaps. What do you think? Like, it needs to be negotiable, not necessarily I have options.
Maybe it's more about just thinking about examples, and what comes to my mind is like, it shouldn't be written like everything is already set in stone, like looking, for example, at the technical solution. It should be, it shouldn't tell the team how exactly to implement the stuff, but more like what should be the outcome, and then the team you can negotiate how we implement it.
That's perfect, because this is one thing I had problems in the past when user stories are written, for example, by someone who's very technical, and they're not gonna, I'm speaking from the experience as a developer. So I had a very experienced engineer acting as a product owner. He wrote a user story, and as an engineer, he entered into the how a little bit. And I was like, no. And then it kind of stuck to my mind that a good user story must focus on what and why. The how, it's best to leave it open, because the ones who are closer to the problem may have an idea that who are the ones who are further away from the problem couldn't think of, right? Have you had experiences in that regard?
I mean, the problem is why I couldn't answer the question is that I just took that as a given. For me, that's just natural.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to hear from you. It's a given because you're blessed. That's not always the case.
Yeah.
I only had, I had a lot of bad experience with where others told me how to test it in the end. And I'm like, so for what do you need me then?
They give you a test plan, right?
Yeah. So I thought I'm the test specialist, but okay. So that's how I came now to this negotiable.
So the negotiable, would you say it's staying away as possible from the how? Is that what negotiable means? So that the how is flexible.
That would be for me my first, that the first thing that comes to my mind. Because talk about like if we for instance create the story and then 2 weeks later, or let's say we have it in the backlog and then for some weeks, and then when we want to pick it up, things have changed. Probably if they changed completely, then we just delete the story and write a new one according to the situation. So I'm with Andy. I haven't seen like really negotiating about the what should be the output. Only small stuff that was adjusted but not negotiated.
Yeah, perhaps we are there also in a specific environment, right? For me, example, I work a lot with legacy applications. So I'm not creating a new product a lot of the times, or I'm more involved in projects in my career, which there are applications built since 8 years or something, and then you try to add features on top, right? And when you have changing teams, and you also have on the side a technical roadmap you would like to implement because you want to make the system sustainable again and editable again, then you need those kind of technical acceptance criteria, how we call it, in what we intend to change there, right? So that's perhaps just an aspect where I'm a bit biased in the experience I have. When I compare it to colleagues which say, yeah, we're greenfield, there is nothing, we actually add new code, which is newly written independent of existing code, or like not 5-year legacy code, then it's also a different situation, because there is a clear architectural decision behind and not technically biased by what's already there, and we need to adjust something.
So to close the negotiable part of story creation, I heard some wise words in the past that a user story is a promise of a conversation. So a user story does not know everything. It's just a conversation starter. So by that definition, it has to be negotiable, right? With that in mind, so it's time for us to go to the next letter, V, valuable. So in my mind, valuable, I tend to look immediately to the product owner and say, hey, is this useful for you? Speaking specifically about like a ticket that is about a feature, right? Not the technical debt ticket or something. But I tend to look at the product owner to make sure that if that small piece of work is valuable or not. So how do you judge whether a user story is valuable or not?
For me, it's it says, I mean, the word user story implicitly already or explicitly says like it should have value for the user. But what I'm experiencing is we tend to think about as the user only as either our business users, so our internal business stakeholders, and not really about the actual end user. I think that doesn't feel right to me. And on the other hand, what about enabling stories? What about technical stories? Who is then the user? Couldn't it be that, I mean, for me, it's absolutely okay to have like a developer getting a value out of a story, and then the development is the user who gets value, or myself as a QA get out value of a story. So what do you think about that?
To be honest, I completely agree. And it's also a very unpopular opinion. But Rodrigo, what's your feeling? I mean, you're now dealing with probably exactly those challenges where the team says, yeah, but in order to do that, I need to do this. And how do you deal with that then? What's your preferred way on taking what's value or what is valuable within a story?
This has been a real challenge because as an engineering manager, you have to be able to communicate what value is with a product manager, right? So the product manager wants to deliver cool features to bring value to the product, and that's it, right? But the engineering side knows what do we need to do to keep delivering that value, right? So how do you explain to a product person, for example, hey, to do this shopping cart, I know we have a database, right? The product person knows what a database is, of course, but you have to say, hey, you see, it would be interesting if we had an in-memory cache so that it's much faster to retrieve that information. And since we need speed in there and we want to separate like load, right? We want to direct load to the cache, and then, but what does it change for the user? Will it change anything in my cart? Can I see something? You can't, right? So is this valuable? Yeah, it is, right? But not for the end user, at least not when the load is low, right? But when there's like a Christmas sale, a Boxing Day or something, sure, they'll see, yeah, this store is crap, it's not working. My cart is not loading. So how have you ever had the chance to argue about something like that? I like to negotiate in terms of uh, money, right? So potential losses. So if we don't do this now, few months down the road, this is going to mean financial loss because this and that. And then I think that's the easiest way to argue, because like if we have downtime, there's money loss, and then you can say, hey, if our store is down for half an hour, we lose so many thousands of dollars or something. Then that's quantifiable, right? And they have something palpable to discuss with business to see, okay, how important is this in terms of value, and then you have a shared metric to compare. So I think that's the thing about valuable, right?
Yeah, I just wanna emphasize on a certain point. I mean, you had now a very specific example in the outage from application, but perhaps Pia can afterwards a bit add more on that. It's also about just general technical depth stories or tasks which we need to do where there is no imminent risk of an outage, but more of a like slowing down the development process in general, right? And then how, besides just trying to quantify that based on thesis or based on experiences you did in the past, how can you still then argue its value or justify its value? Because it's just very hard graspable. That's at least how I experience it.
Yeah, for that discussion, sometimes I've heard people try to negotiate allocation. So the good old 80-20 rule, right? So we do 80% of feature work, 20% of technical depth work. I mean, the intention behind it is always good, right? But I'm still waiting for the day when I see this working out. Have you ever tried something like that?
Yeah, try it.
Yeah.
That's it.
So basically, from the experience, it always comes down when you enable those rules. We actually had a team of 10 people where when you go by that 80-20% rule, 2 people would just care about technical depth, right? And when you then tell a business owner or business representative, hey, those people just do technical depth. For me, we understand that it's necessary, but the immediate discussion we always had in the past, and we had to shift that slightly, was that there are 2 guys that are delivering no features and no business value.
I see. So the takeaway for valuable is it's not always value to the user, right? It's not final user value. It's like value for the product as a whole, right? Are we building a more robust product, right? So yeah, I liked it. I like it. So the next one in our invest is estimable. So I think this is pretty much a no-brainer, right? So developer and QA, they estimate together like how long they will take to implement that ticket, right? So what would you say makes a user story easy to estimate?
Well, from my point of view, or from my experience, the most easiest stories for estimations were the ones where it was clear to the whole team, so really to every role and discipline, what needs to be done. We've already discussed some kind of high-level ideas how we could do that, like in the refinement, that were my best experiences, where we already in that refinement or in the planning had exchanged some first thoughts about it, Just very briefly, so we usually did that estimation in a time box and said, okay, we take max, let's say 10 minutes to have a quick discussion about that concrete story, and then we make an estimate. So the clearer it was, you know, the less room for interpretation or misinterpretation there was. Yeah, the easier it was to estimate. And then also the estimates were pretty close together.
Yeah, and what would you say it's easier to estimate? A big user story or a small user story?
It should be as small as possible, but as big as needed. So
But
I wouldn't say,
should we prefer the small to the larger one whenever we can, or not necessarily? Sometimes we may have synergies that make sense.
yeah, not necessarily, because for me it really depends. I wouldn't say we shouldn't do big user stories, because there are those where it makes sense. But I think we should focus on, can we finish it in a sprint? Is that feasible, yes or no? And if we have to say no, then yeah, then we need to cut it differently. Then it's too big.
Yep. So I've seen in more than one place that we do story points, right? To estimate. So we always end having a natural breaking point. If it is, in our case, if it is 13 points, let's break it down. It won't be able to be finished. So I think everyone does that, right? They have like a limit. Okay, if it's this big, then cut it, right?
Yeah, mostly when it's big, there is a lot of uncertainty involved in the estimation, right? And then it always helps to break it apart where it makes sense, to just make it more understandable and take away the risky parts and the risky chunks, right? Rule of thumb for me was also in the past always one person should be able to deliver it within a sprint, which I think is nice, but don't quote me on that one story needs to implement it by one person, right? That's not what I meant and not what I said. It's just a rule of thumb. Maximum is one person should manage it in a sprint, and story points for us is not time, right? It's complexity. So also to clarify that again.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. So yeah, as small as we should focus on having something as small as possible and never something bigger than a sprint, right? So that leaves us to the last letter in our acronym, testable. So how do you know that you're done, right? How will you be able to tell that the user story is done? I think that's what it means to be testable, right? What are your ideas on it?
Yeah, absolutely agree. Unfortunately, what I've seen in the past, but also right now still, anyways, is that we only think about how to test when it's already ready for testing. Yeah, it happens. I don't like that because I agree. When we follow this invest, we should think about, is it testable? And if not, then we have to come back to go back and rethink again the story. And maybe could be I've seen that in the past where we found out, okay, we could build that feature, but to test it, we need certain test data we don't have right now. So we need to think about it, how to build it up, and not think about that when we want to start with testing. So yeah, I yes, testable is really important, and think about it already when creating the story. But at the latest, then when we go to refinement or planning, that's for me the latest point where we should be discussing about, is it testable and how?
Yeah, agreed. So yeah, the testable is how you guarantee quality, right? And guaranteeing quality as early as possible is the cheapest way to have quality.
Or perhaps to frame it differently, to ensure what we actually want to have delivered with this item, right?
Yeah, if something is waterproof, water shouldn't go through, right? That's how you test. You throw water at it. But if you say it's water resistant, then how resistant should it be? It should be defined. How do we test it?
And for me, that last point is very important as well to mention. Testing is part of the story.
Yes.
It should not be like there should not be a follow-up story which says test story X, Y, and Y. The reason why I mentioned that is that it's quite a lot of times where I experienced it. Yeah, now we create the story to automate the test cases or to do the testing and to have it then separated because of resource management and stuff. And there, just refer to the start probably of our talk and of our series. We want to try to build the application together and ensure the quality together, and also to build in that quality. And that actually means that we verify what we do immediately with very short feedback cycle. And for that is testable and also to test part of the story.
Yeah, and with that, I think that's all about story creation.